Hello and welcome to this online section of Introduction to Philosophy. This series of videos is recorded for my HUP 101 course, a class that I teach at LaGuardia Community College. My name is Dr. Richard Brown and I will be the instructor of this course. This series of videos is primarily intended for classes, my online classes at LaGuardia College, as I just mentioned. But I've taught this course for many years. I taught it at Brooklyn College before I came to LaGuardia. And so these slides, these PowerPoint slides, also accompany the Chafee book, The Philosopher's Way, which is the book that students in this course will be using. And so these slides then represent what I kind of drew on the board or whatever, a complete course in philosophy. And in order to do that, the first question that we've got to start with, just as by way of introducing the topic, is well, what is philosophy? What is it that we're going to be studying in this series of lectures? And answering this question is very difficult because if you ask 100 different philosophers what it is they do, you're liable to get 100 different answers. So it's not a very easy question to answer. Different people think of philosophy as different things. Now, typically, um, uh, sometimes people conceive of philosophy as asking certain kinds of questions, well, very deep questions about the meaning of life and what's real and those kinds of things. And it's true that philosophers do ask those questions. And so, one way of talking about philosophy is talking about those kinds of questions that philosophers deal with and the kinds of answers that they give. And so, we'll talk about that at the very end of this lecture, talking about the various branches of philosophy. Another way of thinking about philosophy is looking, well, sort of what the word means and how people have thought about it historically. And so that's what I want to turn to first. I want to actually spend a little bit of time talking about what I call the pre philosophical way of thinking, or the way that people thought about reality before philosophy was discovered. And there some characteristic differences in this historical way. And so one thing you'll notice in these lectures is that I'm very historically oriented, and I think that it's very important for us to put the questions we're interested in this kind of historical perspective. So we will be going historically in order. All right, so to start with, then at the beginning, let's give a very brief introduction to the origins of society. And all of this should be taken with a grain of salt, of course, because when we're looking back on history, we're doing our best to reconstruct events that only fragmentary evidence of which survives. So we must always remember that we're doing the best that we can. So we'll be referring to this timeline here over the course of the class. And so here I'll mark where we are now, the present day CE. And those of you probably know that we used to use BC and AD, BC for before Christ, and AD for Anno Domini, which means in Latin the year of our Lord. And the year one here is supposed to mark the historical birth of Jesus of Nazareth. So not everybody is a Christian, and so having these Christian-centric dates, there was a movement away from naming them that way. So we changed it to CE for Common Era, and BCE for before the Common Era, and I used those prefixes here, suffixes here. Um, but the turnaround date is still year one there, where historically many have thought Jesus was actually born. There is some debate about that, as I said earlier. All of this is sort of piecemeal knowledge that we have. And some scholars think, well, maybe he was born slightly earlier than year one or slightly later than year one, by which I mean the actual historical Jesus. But so we're not sure, but that's the date. Year one is set, and that's why it's set at year one. Now, of course, there are many cultures that don't have their dating system this way. So there are cultures that don't start over when they think that Jesus was born, and so for them, they will number the year not 2011 like us, but 5000 and something. But so roughly speaking, then, if this timeline were to extend all the way to the left, a good space using this same kind of rough metric that I've had here, you would have to go another 7 to 10,000 years in the past to find human beings as we think of ourselves now settling down. So this is the invention of farming. You may not think of farming as an invention, but it is an invention. There are certain technologies which are required in order to farm. You need to be able to irrigate. You need to be able to control water by having buckets, for instance, or irrigation channels. You need to be able to use a hoe, planting seeds in nice orderly rows, and etc. So we have evidence, and again, none of this is hard and fast. 10,000 roughly or so years before year one, people started farming. So then, for roughly 7,000 years, people lived in this way, farming, settling down, domesticating animals, no longer living hunter gatherer lifestyles, no longer being nomads, um, uh, but nothing like a city developing. There were still these tribal associations, it's still very family oriented, extended family, and etc. But around 3,500 years before year one, we find city life as we know it, and so what we call civilization, civilized life, developing. And cities back then, of course, would have been much smaller. A very large city would comprise of about 1,000, 2,000 people, something that we don't consider to be very large. But of course, the population back then would have been much smaller. So there would have been very large cities, 1,000 or 2,000 people. Uh, and of course, what corresponds with the origins of civilization are the invention of writing. And human beings around this time seem to have developed writing in various places around the world. So it's not just in the Western world that we find writing, cuneiform tablets, and etc. being developed, but also, of course, everyone knows about Egypt and the hieroglyphs, and lesser known perhaps in the Americas, they are also developing forms of writing, and in China in the East as well. So people are developing writing around this time, and it's interesting to look back at some of these earliest kinds of writings that give us some kind of evidence of what the people thought at the time and the way they viewed themselves in the grander scheme. So I want to take a little bit of a look at that. But first I want to focus on the places that we're going to talk about. So here's some pictures. This is a map of ancient Mesopotamia. And over on the right over there is where we're going to be focusing on Babylon and Sumer. Babylon is where the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers meet. And those of you who are aware of current nations and politics will recognize what is Babylon there as modern day Iraq. So there's Egypt there, the Sinai Peninsula, and of course the out of Africa theory, which uh, some scientists think describes the way we human beings evolved, has it that human beings evolved in Africa and then migrated nomadically up and across the peninsula there and then settled down, started farming in Babylon, in areas in Egypt and so on, where these cities later developed. And so what we find from these early areas are actually pieces of writing which are very illustrative. So I want to look at one in particular, and this is famously known as the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, if you haven't read the Epic of Gilgamesh, you probably should. It's a great story, and it used to be read in English 101 classes. I don't know if they still do or not, or in English 102 or something like that. But it's an epic in the sense of an epic adventure, and it tells the story of a king named Gilgamesh, who was a great king of one of these ancient cities. And Gilgamesh wants to know why people die, what the meaning of life is, and how we can be immortal. So he really wants to know this answer to this question, and he decides that the way he's going to answer it is to go on a journey to where the gods live and to demand of the gods that they tell him, Gilgamesh, the answer to these questions. And so he does. And a lot of adventures ensue. And I won't rehash all of the stuff that happens. He eventually gets to the gods and asks them this question. And they set him a bunch of tasks. They say, Gilgamesh, if you complete these tasks, we'll answer your questions, tell you everything you want to know. The tasks are very much like the kinds of things you find in Greek mythology. He has to kill a certain beast, he has to climb a certain mountain, he has to divert a certain river, and etc. So he does all that stuff. And finally, he comes to the last task, where the gods tell Gilgamesh he must stay awake for 3 days and 3 nights. And if he does this, they will tell him the answer. So he says, no problem. But of course, he doesn't have Red Bull or caffeine or any of the other luxuries of no-dos that modern people use to do all-nighters. So he stays awake for 3 days and 2 nights. And on the third night, he falls asleep. So poor Gilgamesh wakes up in the morning to see the gods saying, oh, well, you were so close, but now you'll never know. He does not complete the tasks and he does not get to know the answer. He becomes very angry, and then he finds out, comes to a realization that the way to be immortal for a human is to have your name remembered by doing great things, by building a great city, by being a fair ruler, and so on and so forth. So this story, this very brief synopsis, a butchering of a story, illustrates 2 points that I want to make. So the first point is that it's sort of wrong to think of philosophy as simply a group of questions. Because notice the kind of question that Gilgamesh is asking here are very deep questions. Why did we die? What's the meaning of life? How do we become immortal? What's the right way to live? And etc. So it's not as though only philosophers are interested in those questions. Human beings are interested in those kinds of questions. That seems to be something that afflicts us in a certain way. We want to know the answer to these questions. But of course, there are different ways of answering those questions. And Gilgamesh embodies a particular way of answering these questions. Notice he never once entertains the idea that he himself can figure out the answer to these questions on his own. Immediately from the beginning, the proposed solution to the problem is to find out those who know, the gods, and to ask them. And this is the general theme of the pre-philosophical way of thinking, that human beings are not capable of knowing the way the world is. Only they are like children who can't understand the most simplest things. The world is filled with these supernatural personalities who really know the world of the gods, as you might be familiar from retellings of these stories, Zeus and Athena and so on. That's who controls reality. And if you want to know, then you've got to ask. Now, of course, these would have been different gods for Gilgamesh and people like him, but the idea is roughly the same. So there's a conception of human beings as supplicants, as not being able to know, as having to be told by divine revelation the way that reality really is. Now, there's another story that illustrates this point as well, and this is something we can see from the Code of Hammurabi. Now, the Code of Hammurabi is famous because it's one of the earliest written laws we have. And you can actually go to the website of the Louvre and read a translation of the Code of Hammurabi. It's there on their website, and it's extremely interesting. I recommend that you do it if you have the opportunity. If you do this, you'll be struck by 2 things. So one is the thing I was mentioning earlier, namely that they're dealing with the same kind of questions and problems that we deal with. So their lives are roughly very similar to our lives. They live in a city. They're around people they don't know and aren't related to, and there are various questions of how you ought to interact with them, what obligations they owe to you, what obligations you owe to them, and ways of coordinating behavior such that you can discourage certain kinds of behavior and encourage other kinds of behavior. Very ordinary problems, so that will be the first thing you're struck by. Now, of course, the way they discourage the behavior is by a very eye for an eye type of justice. And that will be something which is kind of a shock to modern people. Their system of punishment was very, very eye for an eye and very brutal, I guess we might say. But so I won't want to dwell on that, though. That's not really the main point. So the other point, the source of the justification of these laws. So the laws were written on a giant pole, inscribed around it, which was smack dead in the center of the entering gate of the city that Hammurabi controlled, so that any person who walked into the city would be faced first with this inscription of all the laws so that there was no excuse and everybody knew what the laws were. They were right there. You could check them. But why should you obey those laws? Who is Hammurabi to tell you these are the right laws? Why are these ones as opposed to some other set or no set at all? Well, the answer is contained in the preamble of the Code of Hammurabi, and the answer is roughly this. Hammurabi is a son of God. He's the slayer of Tiamat, the great dragon, the order of chaos, etc., and blah, blah, blah. He built this, he did that, God's his father, etc., etc. And so who else better to know than Hammurabi? So again, we see this appeal to divine intervention, divine revelation, as the only real way of knowing what these laws are. So notice that nowhere in the preamble is there anything like, well, we've thought about it carefully and these appear to be the best way to achieve the goals that we've set for ourselves. Goal 1, coordinated behavior. Goal 2, commerce, etc. So nothing about us discovering the truth, but a lot about the truth being revealed by a greater source. And that really is what's contrasted with the origin of Western philosophy. So now again, just before we move on, I want to take a second to emphasize that I'm talking here about Western philosophy, and we could tell a different story talking about the origins of Eastern philosophy or American philosophy. So since we're talking about the sort of society of the West, which has its origins in ancient Greece, that's where we're going to be focusing. But that's not to say there's anything overly specifically special about the Greek people at this time. People have been interested in these questions, and people around the world have developed answers to them. Although people in ancient Greece have one really definitively Western way of dealing with these problems and questions, which has influenced the spread of our culture. So we'll be taking a look at that. So again, here's our timeline. Now there, remember, farming invented about 10,000 years before year 1. Civilization begins, the invention of writing, about 3,500 years, roughly, again, debatable, but roughly around that area, before year 1. And so when does philosophy start? Well, we date the origins of Western philosophy to about 600 years before year 1. Notice that's roughly 3,000 years from the beginning of writing to the origins of philosophy. So during that time period, the pre-philosophical way of thinking, as I have characterized it, dominates. And we can think right around 1200 BCE, so that's right around the mark there where it says 1,000, as where many scholars think that Moses lived. And of course, Moses gave us the 10 Commandments, and that's prototypical of this pre-philosophical way of thinking. What's the right way to live your life? Well, you can't answer that question. Moses goes to a mountain. God reveals to him directly the correct rules for living a good life. And then Moses comes back and says, God told me this is the right way to do it. So that's another way of thinking about, and of course, if you don't do it, God intervenes and punishes you. So these are kind of the twin ideas of the pre-philosophical way of thinking. When there's an earthquake, God's punishing you for breaking some rule. When there's a nice, bountiful harvest, God's rewarding you for following the rules. And so it's important for us to know what the rules are and the way the world works, but we can't know for ourselves, so we're dependent on somebody else, the gods, handing that down and then them handing that down to us. So that's roughly the pre-philosophical way of thinking. And the philosophical way of thinking begins around 600 years before year 1. And I should caution, just so that there's no misunderstanding, it's not as though once philosophy is discovered, this older way of thinking goes out of date. People still subscribe to this view, and people did at that time as well. So it's just that this is the earliest that we know of where people start advocating some other way of thinking about human beings and our relation to reality. So let's take a look. So this is where we're going to be spending roughly 1/3 of the class is spent in ancient Greece, almost over 1/3 of the class actually. So it's good to get familiar with it. So just look at the map for a second. You can see the Aegean Sea there. separating Greece on the left from Ionia on the right. Ionia was the ancient name for that landmass. Nowadays, we would call that's where Turkey is, but this is a map of ancient Greece. So the Isle of Crete down there at the bottom, the Cretans who lived on the Isle of Crete, even in the ancient period, had a reputation for being liars. Aristotle uh, famously wrote he was perplexed about the sentence, all Cretans are liars. So I don't know what those ancient Cretans were up to, but they seem to have developed a bad rep. So then moving on up, you can see the Corinth there, and Corinth is famous from the letters from the Corinthians and to the Corinthians, which are included in the Bible. Then up at top, there's the Oracle at Delphi, and Delphi and the Oracle will play an important part of the story of the life of Socrates, and we'll talk about that. But you must know the Oracle from at Delphi from other sources. More than likely, you know it as the source of the prophecy that a certain person would marry their mother and kill their father. And I'll leave you to fill in the name of that famous person. But I'm sure you know who I'm talking about. Okay, and then there's Athens, which is where a lot of the action will take place because there is where Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. Socrates was an Athenian, and Plato was the student of Socrates and starts the academy there, and Aristotle goes to study there. So with Plato at the academy, and then starts his own school. And so Athens has always been an important part of ancient philosophy. But actually, the story starts over in Ionia in a city called Miletus. And the earliest philosophers, as far as we know, and again, remember, history is mostly a guessing game because we're always trying to figure out what happened on the basis of incomplete evidence. Um, so we don't really know what happened 600 years before the birth of Jesus, but we have some ideas, and most of them come from historical writers like Aristotle, for instance, and Theophrastus, and there are others who are writing about this period, and we have those writings. So a lot of it is pieced together. And so we're not saying that no one ever had these ideas before. It's quite possible that there was a person before this period of time who had a lot of similar ideas, but we don't have anything written down which has survived which indicates that this is so. So what we have now, the best evidence suggests that what we're going to call philosophy originated in Miletus roughly 600 years before year one. And in particular, with an individual named Thales. And Thales was roughly born in the 620s, 620 years before year one. We don't really know because the ancients didn't really keep birth records. They weren't interested in when someone was born. They were more interested in when someone died. So we have really complete death records. We know that he died in 546. Now notice that these dates go backwards, and that's because, of course, we're counting down to year one, whereas where we are now in the year 2011, we're counting away from year one. So it's not weird to be born in 620 and die in 546. That's the way we date things back then. And Thales is a real interesting person. There's a lot that can be said about him, and I'll spend some time talking about Thales. And the people around him, other Greeks, Anaximander and Anaximenes, those are hard to say. Wait till you see how they're spelled. Okay, so what were and these collectively are known as the pre-Socratic philosophers, and there's some other ones we'll talk about. There's a whole section on pre-Socratic philosophy. Um, don't worry about why it's called that for now, but that's what, and we'll talk about that later. That is what it's called. So these Thales, for instance, was interested in questions about the makeup of the physical world. He wanted to know whether or not there was some fundamental stuff, some thing out of which all the other stuff was made. And he also rejected any kind of supernatural explanations for the things he was interested in. And these kinds of twin interests and ideas here came to dominate a lot of what happened in early Miletus. These excuse me, in early Miletus. In other words, the philosophers who were the earliest philosophers who come before Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. So let me give you some example of the kinds of things that Thales was interested in. He was interested in the shape of the Earth, and this had been something that people had been interested in for a very long time. And there were various theories about the shape of the Earth. Um, but the reasons for given for believing in the shape being this or that were usually uh, related to religion or being revealed by a god or being revealed in a trance. So what Thales did was to try to give arguments that we could figure out what the shape of the earth was ourselves if we paid close attention to our environment. So, for instance, he famously claimed that you would have different experiences of a ship coming in from sea or going out to sea, depending on the shape of the earth. So, if the earth were round, you would expect the ship to disappear gradually, part by part. Whereas if the ship were, if the earth were flat, you would expect the ship to just disappear altogether, all at once, as it faded away gradually. And that experience bore out the first claim that you would see the first part, the lower parts of it disappear first, and the higher parts of it disappear later because it's going around a bend or a curve. So, secondly, also, it had been known for 1,000 years at least, when the Babylonians kept very, very meticulous records of eclipses and the activities of the stars and planets and so on. And it had been known or thought that what happened during an eclipse was that the shadow of the Earth was being cast on the thing being eclipsed. So when the moon is eclipsed, that's the Earth's shadow that you see. And Thales argued that since the shape of the shadow on the Earth would give you some evidence to the shape of the actual Earth itself, since that was the thing that was casting its shadow, and that the shape of the Earth was circular, perhaps spherical, and so that would give you some good reason to believe that that was the shape that the Earth actually had. So now notice again what's important when the point that's being made here is that Thales is not the first person to ever suggest that the Earth is round or spherical. People had suggested that before. For instance, there are people who claim that the Earth is the shape of an egg. And this is because it was revealed to them that way. There was some mystical, divine source to the idea. Whereas what Thales here is arguing is that, well, even if that is revealed to you, so he's not particularly criticizing belief in gods here, even if that is the case, we still ourselves can determine it so that we can tell what the shape of the earth is by thinking about it, by looking carefully. Now, Thales also thought that he had an answer to this idea. The question was everything fundamentally unified somehow? And people debate about exactly what he meant by this, but he's famous for, or at least Aristotle cites him as saying that the fundamental principle of reality is water somehow. That's taken to mean either that the original state of the universe was water, or that things are somehow still composed of water, so that a piece of wood would be like ice, really, really compactified. But the basic idea that Thales had, and that other pre-Socratic Milesian philosophers, these earliest philosophers had, was that there was some fundamental stuff which existed sort of unformed and contained within it the essences of everything else, and somehow that stuff was transformed into the many things that we see around us. And that was a basic idea that these guys had, that there was some basic fundamental stuff out of which other things came. And then they would debate about, well, what was the fundamental stuff? So, and they would give arguments. So, for instance, some people would claim that water is a better candidate than, say, for instance, fire, because water is frozen and turns into ice, and it can be also evaporated into gas forms, and so we can see already how it occupies different states. And then people would debate. So that's just not to get into these debates. We'll touch on some of the pre-Socratic debates in that section, but just to give you a flavor of the kinds of things that these guys were interested in, and also to try to show you that they weren't merely saying that this was revealed to them, but were trying to discover the fundamental nature of reality on their own. Okay, and also they give naturalistic answers. So whereas earlier, for instance, an earthquake might have been thought of as an expression of the wrath of a god for not following some rule of theirs, Thales argues that these are not appropriate explanations. that the world around us is an orderly system which is constructed according to certain kinds of rational principles, and that we as rational human beings can kind of try to figure out what those rational principles are. So, for instance, Thales argued that what an earthquake was on analogy to a boat in the water. When the boat is floating and the wind blows, the boat rocks back and forth, and someone on the boat would think of that as a quaking. And so an earthquake, Thales hypothesized, must mean that the earth is floating on water and rocking back and forth like a boat would. Now, of course, we know that that's wrong. We talk about tectonic plates and pressures causing earthquakes, and we don't talk about Earth floating on water. In fact, we don't think that islands technically float on water. So we know that Thales is wrong in these instances, but notice the approach that he's taken is radically different. So we can figure out what an earthquake is. And there's kind of evidence that it might be something like this, given that there's a similar phenomenon. So Thales is here thinking that we ourselves have the abilities to figure out the way the world works. And he's not necessarily criticizing religion. There can still be gods and there can still be divine revelation. That can be one way of knowing. But Thales is advocating another way of knowing, one that involves the use of human reason. So let's take a second to sum up the things that I've been talking about in this first part of the lecture. So one theme I've been trying to emphasize is that philosophy isn't really distinguished by the questions that it asks, because people have asked those questions all the time. They've always asked them. Really what makes, so those questions are just common to human beings. What makes something philosophical is rather the approach one takes to the questions themselves rather than the actual asking of the questions. Because I want to say that Gilgamesh was asking the same question about the meaning of life and immortality that a philosopher might ask, but that his way of answering it is very different. Whereas he wants to appeal to divine revelation, the philosopher says that we don't appeal to divine revelation. So the pre-philosophical way of thinking is really characterized by those two claims there on the bullet points. The first is that divine revelation is the only source of knowledge. Human beings aren't capable of knowing on their own. And secondly, that the physical world around us is controlled by these supernatural personalities, and they can intervene at any point that they want to enforce their will. So it's up to us to try to figure out what they want and make them favor us as opposed to disfavor us. So that's what I'm calling the pre-philosophical way of thinking. Now, Thales and his contemporaries deny both of these claims. So rather than divine revelation, Thales says reason, argument, and observation are sources of knowledge about the world. So now notice that combined in there are things that we would call science, things that we would call philosophy. And part of the history of this is the gradual separation of things which we call science and things which we call philosophy. But at this time, they're all wrapped up into one, and people don't really recognize a distinction between philosophy and science, except for that they're different kinds of philosophy. So natural philosophy would have been the philosophical study of the natural world, as opposed to, so the way that physical objects move would have been thought of as a branch of philosophy. And indeed, Newton, who writes his book on gravity and etc., publishes it under the title The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. So Newton referred to what he was doing as natural philosophy. So we'll see a distinction get made eventually, but doing it historically, these ideas are all wrapped up. So reason, argument, and observation are sources of knowledge. And that's a denial that revelation is necessary for knowledge. But again, be careful. It's not a denial that revelation can be a source of knowledge. So there is no conflict with religion in the definition of philosophy that we're talking about here. You can be a religious philosopher. You can be someone who thinks that reason and argument are sources of knowledge, and also someone who thinks that God can reveal knowledge to us if he, she, it so chooses. So there's no conflict between religion and philosophy. The only conflict here is between views on which human beings are incapable of finding answers to these questions on their own, and views on which they are capable of finding answers to these questions on their own. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that we'll like the answers that we find. We may find out the answers to be contrary to what we thought, hoped, etc. But the idea is that by reason, observation, careful reflection, we'll be able to discover the way things are. And that was really what Thales and the other pre-Socratic philosophers thought distinguished them from the other way of thinking about the world, where human beings are supplicants, always asking to be told, but never taking action, never figuring it out on their own. And what this amounts to for Thales really is an emphasis on mathematics, and at this point in time in the history of the universe, geometry in particular. And so I want to stop just for a second and say something about geometry, because it really is important for understanding this whole period in ancient philosophy. So it's hard for us modern contemporary people to think about geometry in the right way. Geometry seems to us to be something you learn in seventh grade, some very basic simple math, something you memorize some formulas for squares and circles and areas and blah, blah, blah. And then later on you learn more interesting, important things like trigonometry and calculus. But of course, that's not the way the ancient people thought about geometry. Geometry actually originated not in Greece, but in Egypt for a very practical purpose. So if you think about the word geometry, you actually see its original purpose encoded. So the word comes from geometria, geo meaning earth, metria meaning measurement. And so geometria is literally the measurement of earth. And the Egyptians needed this very practical ability to measure areas on the ground because of the flooding of the Nile, which was a regularly scheduled event, so to speak, in Egypt, even to this day. So the ancient Egyptians would set their calendar by the flooding of the Nile. They'd say that's day one right there with the Nile floods. That's New Year's. That's month one. Um, this is a very reliably reoccurring disastrous event. And of course, if you own property and you have a fence up and the Nile floods and your fence goes away, then you need a way to reestablish where the fence went. So you need a way to say how wide 5 hectares of land, 5 square hectares of land really is. You need a way to say where that fence actually gets reestablished. Now, Thales gets the credit for introducing geometry into Greece. The story goes that he went to Egypt, as was common for Greek men in their education to spend the last year of it abroad. So Thales goes to Egypt and studies with Egyptians, and he sees them doing this, measuring the earth. He brings geometria back to Greece. But instead of using it for this practical, applied purpose, Thales becomes interested in proving theorems about geometry. He becomes interested in showing, for instance, that if you take 2 right triangles who have a certain area and combine them, you can always make them into a square, and the area of the square will have exactly the same area as the sum of both of the right triangles. So very basic facts about geometry. These are things which are known by reason, and this method becomes something that the ancient philosophers really become transfixed by, and the history of philosophy is struggling with whether this is really true or not. But it's one of the very earliest ideas, philosophical ideas that people had. And that was that there seems to be some things which can be known directly by reason. And that reason is a special sense in a way, but kind of like seeing, but in a different way. It gives us access to the way things have to be, the way things must be. And this becomes a very important theme. And it's all analogized to this idea that in geometry, what you do is you start with a set of axioms, which are indisputable, which are known directly by reason. And then you expand from those and prove various other truths about reality, the way reality must be, which you didn't know beforehand. So, for instance, one of the axioms of geometry is the parallel postulate, the idea that two parallel lines will never meet. So, if you look at these two lines of text on the bullet points here, those two lines are parallel to each other, and you don't need to walk the lines and make sure they never cross. You can kind of just tell by thinking about it, they'll never cross. The definition of a line on which all of geometry is founded in some sense, simply a straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points. You can't really prove that. There's no way that you can say, here's the argument for why that's the case. It's just something that you can kind of see has to be true, but not see with your eyes, seeing with reason. And this idea becomes extremely influential, that the way that mathematics works is kind of a guide for how we'll discover the way reality works, by using reason to reverse engineer the principles which govern the way reality is. That was, in some sense, I think, a unifying theme of all of ancient philosophy. And as we'll see, because we'll go through these periods of time in philosophy, we'll see this idea gets developed, debated, refined, and it's still a current theme of philosophers today. Okay, now of course, the other claim here is this commitment to the world being natural. And by natural, what they mean is that it's explainable, assuming rational, law-like relationships. So you're not going to appeal to the anger of Zeus to explain what lightning is, but rather you will appeal to some natural phenomena which generalizes and gives a nice universal explanation for why things work that way. So that's what I wanted to suggest, really is at the heart of what philosophy is. Philosophy is this commitment to the claim that we're going to find out the way things are. And that's how it begins. That's how it sees itself self-consciously at its origin. It sees itself as a way of standing against the idea that human beings are incapable of achieving this kind of knowledge. So let's turn now to our second way of thinking about what philosophy is. Because remember, that's the overarching goal of this first lecture, to give us a sense of what philosophy is, what philosophers do. So the more traditional way of doing this is to start with the meaning of the word philosophy. And there's an interesting history there. So this, I think, is probably well known, and so we won't spend overly too much time on it, but we will spend some time because it's standard and not everyone knows it perhaps. So the word philosophy, again, comes from Greek, and that's the interesting thing about English, is that the more Latin and Greek you know, the more English you know, because most of our important words come from those sources. So now, as you probably know, like I said, the source of this word is philosophia. Phila meaning love, and Sophia meaning wisdom. So this is rather famous. Now, what maybe is less famous is who coins this term. And it was actually originated by Pythagoras, and Pythagoras was alive in 570 BCE. So now remember, Thales was alive in 620. So you might ask yourself, well, was that before or after Pythagoras? And of course the answer is that Thales came before Pythagoras, since 620 is further away from year one than 570 is. And we don't know a lot about the Pythagoreans, although they're very interesting, and we will talk briefly about Pythagoras and his followers when we talk about pre-Socratic philosophy more fully, instead of just this introductory way. So Pythagoras is more famous for his theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, which is a theorem of geometry, and describes the behavior of a right triangle and the relationships of its sides to each other. So that's basic geometry. But Pythagoras suggested that we should be called philosophers as a way to distinguish what they were interested in from another group of people, which they called the sophists. And this really is the way that Socrates and Plato saw the line up. So the sophists were a loose group of philosophers who were united by a couple of themes. And these are the themes here. Excuse me, these are the themes here. So sophist, of course, means wise people, from Sophia there. And in English, we still use this word, so that's where we say sophisticated, meaning sort of wise, intelligent. Um, but also, as sophisticated has a kind of negative connotation if you, in certain uses, something can be too sophisticated, and that's retaining some of this older use of the word sophistry. So sophists were often skeptics. Now, skeptic is someone who thinks that we can't know what the truth is. More radically, someone who thinks there is no such thing as the truth. And so they would often argue that, look, whatever you think is true, that's just true for you, and there's no real such thing as the truth of the matter or anything like that. So famously, a sophist named Protagoras proclaimed that man was the measure of all things. And people took that to mean that, look, whatever you think is true is true. So philosophy, in this sense of the word, was opposed to that kind of view. Philosophy stood for the search for the truth. Wisdom being kind of the idea that we're looking for the truth here. So a philosopher was someone who wanted to know the way things really were. They didn't know, so it wasn't as though they actually had that knowledge, but they wanted to know. And so they saw themselves more in line with the early Milesians, namely in the sense of thinking there is a truth and that we're able to discover it. We haven't discovered it yet, but we want to discover. We're sort of wounded, and that's where the word wonder sort of has its roots from this kind of wounding by these intellectual questions. You just are burnt up with curiosity over whether there's a fundamental stuff out of which everything else is made, or what the real nature of reality is. Is movement possible? These kinds of questions eat you up at night. And so that's the idea of the philosopher as the seeker of truth, as opposed to these sophists who don't really care about the truth and instead are interested in power and rhetoric, where rhetoric is simply the idea that you convince the other person that you're right. And so we'll see some of this get played out when we look at Socrates and the Platonic dialogues, where Socrates talks to a famous sophist whose name is Thrasymachus, and we'll see this idea that, well, he'll only talk if he's paid. He doesn't really love it. He's just doing it for the money, and he's only interested in power and who's controlling other people, as opposed to the philosopher who's really interested in the truth, who's a seeker of knowledge and of wisdom. So now this adds to the previous way of thinking. So it's still a way of saying, well, look, we can figure out what's going on, but it adds a deeper dimension of commitment to finding out the way things really are, and not merely convincing other people that you're right. Okay, so finally now coming to our third and final part of the lecture, we can talk about the various traditional branches of philosophy and the questions that philosophers deal with, or some of them anyway. So, first branch of philosophy, perhaps the most fundamental, although we can debate about that, but often thought to be the most fundamental, is the branch known as metaphysics, which is defined as the study of the ultimate nature of reality. Now, where the word metaphysics comes from, it just comes from the name of the book that Aristotle wrote on this, so there's no real special meaning attached to metaphysics. Aristotle wrote a book on physics where he talked about how objects move, and then he wrote a second book on what it meant to be an object at all and what kinds of objects could exist and so on. And that simply became referred to as the book after the physics. After the physics, you say in Greek, ta meta, ta physica, after metaphysics. So it became shortened through history, simply referred to as metaphysics, and that's where the word comes from. Often students are disappointed that there's no special hidden meaning to the term metaphysics, but even so, you can see that it's an appropriate title, because meta means something that comes before, and physics, the study of the physical world. So often metaphysicians think that what they're interested in comes prior, or is at a somehow higher level of abstraction than what physicists are interested in. Physicists are interested in describing the actual laws of nature, and metaphysics are interested in describing the way things could be, the way things have to be, the way they must be. So, what kind of questions then do they discuss? Well, we've already looked at one of the basic questions in metaphysics, excuse me, which is whether there are fundamental parts out of which everything else is made, or whether, as the famous story goes, it's turtles all the way down. Now, if you don't know this story, let me just tell you really quickly. It used to be wondered what the earth rested upon, and of course, Atlas was thought to hold the earth on his shoulders in Greek mythology. And then people asked, well, what does Atlas stand on? And then someone said he stands on a giant turtle. And then someone said, well, what does that turtle stand on? And then someone said, that turtle stands on another turtle. And then someone said, well, what does that turtle stand on? And then the teacher replied, son, it's turtles all the way down. So a turtle on a turtle on a turtle on a turtle. And so sort of, that's a joke, of course, but you can see what the point is supposed to be. So is there an infinite series of smaller parts and smaller parts and smaller parts and smaller parts and smaller parts? Or is there some fundamental level at which parts stop? And there's a basic set, perhaps, of things out of which other things are constructed. That's a basic question in metaphysics, and there are various answers to it. Now, it was thought for a long time that there was a basic stopping point, which was known as the atom, and the Greeks came up with that word. In Greek, atom means atomos, or unsplittable, the basic element, which couldn't get any smaller. We'll look at some early Greek versions of atomism. But modern physics suggests the atom has parts, quarks, electrons, protons. Those things have parts, quarks. Some suggest those are composed of strings. So it's an open question right now, still unresolved, whether there's a smallest part or whether it's turtles all the way down. So we'll look at some of the historical positions on this, which are very interesting. So a related question is one about whether reality is completely physical or whether there are non-physical elements to reality. This is a very deep and vexing question, which has a long history. So there are all kinds of things have thought at one point were candidates for being non-physical. These range from everyday objects like numbers, 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, 100. Some philosophers have argued those are non-physical objects. Things like God, being perfect, unchangeable, existing at all times. Some have argued that moral facts, that it's wrong to kill innocent people for no reason, is a non-physical fact about reality which can't be captured by any physical thing out there. And I mean, these transcend from simple things like ghosts and ectoplasm all the way to the perfect divine unity. So there are, of course, excuse me, I almost forgot, another main candidate for being non-physical is the human mind, or whatever makes humans human. So we'll look at various proposed metaphysical schemes where things are physical or not physical. Very deep and perplexing questions here. Now, of course, another deep and perplexing question, which we'll look at, is what's the nature of causation? How does one thing cause another? It seems to be commonplace in our ordinary experience. We know that changes are brought about through cause and effect. And so the concept of change, the concept of cause and effect, what they are in the world, is going to be something that philosophers are very concerned about, metaphysicians. Another very large branch of metaphysics is questions about whether the will is free, whether my actions are determined by laws of physics, for instance, or by God's foreknowledge, are the traditional ways of putting it. Now, in this class, we won't be focusing too much on these issues, although they are central and deserve to be focused on. I usually focus on them in my ethics class, where issues of freedom and moral responsibility arise, and in my philosophy of religion class, where issues of freedom and the problem of evil and God's foreknowledge come up. So and there's just not enough time to cover everything, so free will gets sort of left on the side in this class, although I've always felt guilty about that, and have maybe now that it's in the online format, might include some lectures on it, but because I have them from the other courses. So I'm not sure, but I'd be interested to hear what people thought about that. Okay, so then concluding this is question about what exists. What does it mean to exist? Um, do numbers exist? If so, what does it mean to say that something exists physically or something exists non-physically? What's the difference there? So when you're talking about these kinds of questions, which focus narrowly on existence, people have often referred to it under the term ontology. And ontology comes from the Greek word ontos, meaning being, and ology, meaning study of. So ontology is the study of being, or what it means to have being. And these kinds of questions are inherently metaphysical, although sometimes you will use you'll hear the word ontology being used to talk about what a particular person thinks is real. So in your ontology, you might include things like numbers, ghosts, God, persons, tables, chairs, dogs, cats, electrons, quarks. You might exclude things like numbers, gods, cats, etc. So debates about ontology are debates about what has existence, what does it mean to have existence, and we'll see some of these ancient people were very interested in this question, but it's also one that we still are dealing with in our contemporary times. Okay, so on the flip side of that, so on the one hand, we have questions about the nature of reality, what is really real, if that makes any sense, and how is that reality? On the other hand, we have questions about how we come into contact with that reality, how we know about it. So the Greek word for one kind of knowledge is episteme, and therefore epistemology is the study of knowledge. Now there are various questions that epistemologists addressed. One of the more fundamental questions is, what is truth? What does it mean for a sentence to be true? The traditional answer, the one which seems commonsensical, that somehow our language describes reality and sentences are true when it describes it correctly, leads to all sorts of interesting results in metaphysics, namely that there must be something out there correctly described by the things that we say and talk about. And as we'll see, this is what starts a lot of trouble. Maybe therefore it even leads us to believe that numbers have to exist, or even possibly that all things have to exist, because we can talk about things which don't seemingly exist. So there are all sorts of questions about the relationship between things we say and think and the way the world is, and those are epistemological questions. So now, of course, the big question in epistemology is what knowledge is. What does it mean to know something? And we'll look at various accounts of what that means. Plato has a theory of knowledge, which is fairly well developed, and this is still an area of contemporary debate. So now, of course, we want to know what the difference is between belief and knowledge. So one thing you can say is, well, it seems like you can believe things that are false, but it doesn't seem like you can know something that is false. Well, so these are different states then. What's the relationship? Traditionally, people have thought knowledge is belief plus something else and have wondered what that something else is. More contemporary issues take a knowledge first view and say, well, knowledge is we know things, and then belief must be somehow less than knowledge, and then they look for what's missing. So there are various views about what this relationship is, and we're not going to really talk about them in this class, but for people who are interested later, these are going to be very important questions. And of course, as I just said, we want to know how this thing is related to truth. So merely having a true belief doesn't mean you know it. For instance, it could be that you have a belief that's true, but it's accidentally true. A famous case of something like this would be, for instance, maybe looking at a clock which is broken. It's on the wall, it says 4 o'clock. As it happens, it turns out it really is 4 o'clock when you look at the clock. So you form a belief that it's 4 o'clock. It's true that it's 4 o'clock. You have some reason to believe that it's 4 o'clock. The clock has been reliable in the past, but it doesn't seem like you really know it. And then people debate this issue. Do you know it? Do you not know it? If so, why not? So there are interesting questions about what the general concept of knowledge is. Now here's one that the history of philosophy has struggled with, and one that we'll be looking at a lot in this class. So assuming we do know things, where do we get it? And as we've seen already, the early philosophers have this mixed idea that there are some things which are knowable by reason, like that parallel lines don't cross and that the shortest distance between any 2 points is a straight line. And then there are other things which you know by the senses, like that the shape of the shadow of the earth is spherical or gives us reason to believe that the earth is spherical, etc. So there's a large dispute about what the real sources of knowledge are. And we'll see that one popular interpretation of the history of philosophy, this actually was made popular by Kant, who looked back at the history of philosophy and said, look, here's what you see, and lots of people have agreed with him, is namely a struggle between what are known as rationalists, who think that knowledge comes from reason and is all based on mathematics and logic and stuff like that, and those who are called the empiricists, who believe that science and empirical observation are the real sources of knowledge. So there is a way of looking at the history of philosophy where these views are fighting. And the earliest view, as you might have guessed, is a kind of rationalist view where the senses are downplayed, and science comes in later as a challenge to this kind of view. And so that's one way of looking at the history of philosophy, and we'll roughly approach things that way, although I'll point out along the way where people disagree. Now, here's another question about epistemology. How do you know that you know something when you in fact do know it? So, for instance, rationalists like to think that there's a way of telling that you know something, that there's a certain kind of experience, a rational kind of compelling, a feeling of force to believe something when reason tells you it has to be that way. Like, for instance, when you think about the parallel postulate that parallel lines cannot meet, you know that that's got to be true. You know that you know it. You have knowledge that that's true, and you know it because it feels special in a sense. Now, of course, there's been a debate about that, and we'll look at the various counterexamples. In fact, it turns out maybe the parallel postulate is itself one of these counterexamples, although people have responded that it can be interpreted in a way that's consistent. So we'll look at those kind of questions. Now, of course, here's another big question. What about the skeptic? Is it possible to know anything at all? The skeptic says, look, you don't know that the laws of nature are necessary and universal. You don't know that the physical world exists. You don't know that the world wasn't created 5 minutes ago and that all your memories aren't false. So there's a real serious challenge here. How can we be sure that what we have is really knowledge as opposed to something else? And we'll look at that. There are some serious arguments for skepticism, and we'll look at the way that people have tried to deal with those arguments. Okay, now, metaphysics and epistemology are clearly related to each other as two sides of a coin are. So as soon as you say what's real, you're telling me that you know what's real. So you're already talking about you must have some way to know that the things you're talking about are that way. Now, of course, as soon as you start talking about what knowledge is, you talk about which things can be known, and so which things are real. And so the two are intimately related. And we cross back and forth from talking about epistemology to talking about metaphysics. But it's extremely important to keep them clear. No matter how related they are different types of questions. One, a question about what is real, what is out there. The other, a question about what we know, question about us. And we'll see gradually a separating of these as we move through this stuff. Now, apart from these two major branches, we can also see the branch of philosophy known as ethics. Ethics can be informally defined as the study of right and wrong, or good and bad. Where what do we mean? Right actions, good persons, which things should we not do, which things should we do. It's in general the study of which things have value. What is the nature of value? That's a question which ethicists want to know. What does it mean? Are there objective values? Are there things which all persons have to value? Or are there merely only relative values? So now if you think about sort of value theory in this broad sense, that's going to include the branches of philosophy traditionally known as aesthetics and political philosophy. So aesthetics is the study of the beautiful, what's the nature of art, but really it's a question about what's valuable, whether art is valuable, what's beauty, the relation of beauty to value. And of course, political philosophy, questions about what the best form of government is. These are all value judgments, and there's relationships between these three. Although ethics, aesthetics, the study of art and beauty, and political philosophy are separate, they can all be branched under one major category known as the study of values. So now ethics, more traditionally construed as the subject of the study of right and wrong, good and bad, what we're interested in there are what actions are moral. Is abortion immoral? Is abortion moral? Is suicide immoral? Is suicide moral? Lying, and etc. Now, of course, the big question in ethics is the skeptical one, the one about whether we can know the moral truths or whether there are any such things as moral truths in the first place. So the relativist thinks there's no such thing as real truth. It's relative to you or this or the other thing. And whereas, excuse me, relativism about mathematics has never been very popular, relativism about ethics remains extremely popular. And so there's a serious question about whether it's true or not. And a large part of an ethics class is spent dealing with the arguments for and against relativism. Now, another question which it falls under this category, but which is not so much addressed by contemporary persons as it used to be by ancient persons, this is the question of what kind of life one should live. Is it better to live a life of seeking money or of seeking intellect or of seeking pleasure? And there are various answers to that question in the history of philosophy. Now, we're not going to be talking too much about ethical questions, although we will talk about briefly some of the issues because Socrates was interested in them, and you can't talk about Socrates without bringing these questions up. Okay, but this is primarily a class on metaphysics and epistemology, and primarily the history of that and the way it interacts with what we think currently. Okay, so finally then the last branch, bringing this all to a close, the study of logic, which can be defined as the art of good and bad reasoning or of good and bad arguments. And so notice that this is extremely important because earlier I was talking about philosophy as the use of reason and argument to discover what is true or what can be known. And if that's the case, logic is extremely important because it's our science of determining which arguments are good, which reasoning is bad. And so it occupies a very central place. And we will touch on some logic. In fact, I'll give a brief introduction to syllogistic logic, the logic of Aristotle, and extend it sort of to truth functional logic, contemporary logic, just briefly enough to hopefully interest one in taking a logic class, because logic is something that improves one's ability to reason, and even though it's related to mathematics in a certain sense, is more fundamental perhaps than mathematics, and hopefully mathematical truths are expressible in terms of logical truths, or at least that was the hope of one group of philosophers. And maybe by the end of the class, we'll be in a position to say something about that, although I'm not sure. Okay, so that concludes